Welcome to Wizard Team, a Black magical podcast for Black magical stories.
Hi everyone, it's Bayana, Robyn, and Porshèa embarking on a journey through the many fantasy stories written by and about Black people. Today we're really excited to be joined by Alexis Henderson, author of An Academy for Liars. Hi Alexis.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming
Thanks
through.
for coming. Can you briefly let our audience know what An Academy for Liars is about?
Yeah, I call Academy for Liars kind of like a magical dark campus novel. Some people might call it dark academia, and I think that fits too. And it follows my main character, Lennon, whose life is falling apart, and she gets a mysterious phone call inviting her to come sit a test for a university called Drayton, and it's kind of set in a hidden pocket of Savannah, Georgia. And there she learns how to kind of wield this magical force called persuasion, and yeah, things sort of unravel from there. It's pretty dark, but...
When did the idea of this book come into your head, and what influences and inspirations did you pick up and incorporate as you were writing the story?
So I think I got the idea, it was like years ago. And it's really interesting. Originally, I thought it might be like a kind of sci-fi-y, and it just didn't work. So I had like a lot of like all the same cast and characters, but the world was like very, very, very different. And it just didn't feel grounded, didn't feel right for me. And so I kept kind of workshopping it for years. Like this is well before my first novel came out. So I workshopped it, and it was just kind of an impossible book. And I literally remember telling like my friends and family, like, this is the book where I'm going to lose it. Like I meant it literally. Like I felt like every time I was working on this project, I was getting like more mentally unwell and like frustrated and stressed, but I kept throwing myself at it. And I think I kind of completed some early drafts, wasn't really happy with what I had. And finally, I just kind of was reintroduced to my main character in a way when I got this idea for someone whose life is just going so awry that it's almost like comical. Like everything was going wrong for her, and I kind of picked up there. And once I understood, okay, that's who she is, and that's where we're starting, the book kind of unraveled, and I workshopped it with my editor as well. And we kind of, through that experience, I developed this idea of setting Drayton, the school where the story takes place, in my hometown in Savannah. And I think that once I made that connection to that setting, and I realized, oh my God, this is my Savannah book. Yeah, it really kind of unfolded for me. And I definitely had like influences. I was lucky enough to read Babel when I think I blurbed it actually. So I have like a very coveted arc of Babel that people have literally asked to buy off me. And I'm like, you can't buy arcs, first of all. And second of all, absolutely not. Like, I don't care how much you want to pay me. Never. I love Babel so much. So I think that like, obviously An Academy for Liars and Babel are very, very different, but I think that I was really encouraged to see people who are fascinated with the same sorts of things that I was. And namely, that's like the role of people of color in these academic institutions and what people of color do with the power that is attained through those institutions. So that was a touchstone for me. Vita Nostra was another one, just because I really loved the magic system and how it was very like cerebral and focused on the mind. I'm trying to think of others. Inception, weirdly, I love Inception. And there's definitely still, I think, some kind of like tendrils of science fiction that weave through the novel. I couldn't quite detach myself from that, and I think that's why, in some ways, I've literally heard people describe this book as anything under the sun. I've had people say it's science fiction. I've had people say it's a thriller. I've had people tell me it's horror. I've had people tell me that it's dark fantasy. I think I had someone say it was a romantasy, and I was like, sure, I'll take whatever. I think so many people have so many different reactions to this book, and I think it's because there's like probably in some ways like a little bit of everything in there. So
Cool. Speaking of like multiple different genres, your first two books were solidly kind of like in the horror genre, whereas like An Academy for Liars, it incorporates some elements of horror, but also there's like that primarily dark academia and contemporary like fantasy. Did you find yourself approaching this book differently than you did with the others? And was there anything that surprised you whenever you were writing this time around?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think, okay, it's really, one thing I think that's like interesting to me is that now like people tell me nowadays, like, you know, when they refer to my previous books, so like they're obviously horror novels. And what's interesting is I didn't publish them as horror. Like The Year of the Witching, I think to this day, at least the hardcovers, is like fantasy on the spine. So when I sold and published them, I was thinking of them as like a slightly scarier fantasy novel, and then everyone was like, no, this is horror, and I love horror, so I ran with it. But I think that, to me, I would have just realized it's really normal for me to have some sort of dissonance between what I think my books are and how they sit on shelves and the kinds of readers who pick them up. And so I've become very comfortable, and I really love just like letting readers decide the genre that I'm writing. And because I kind of knew that going in, like my experience in my past 2 books, when I approached an Academy for Liars, I just kind of like, I was like, I'm just going to do my thing and readers will figure it out. Like readers will tell me and connect with the story the way they do, and they will tell me what I'm writing. And I also have like a team that I really trust, right, to like lean on. They can kind of have more perspective, but for me, I'm really close to the book, so it's kind of hard for me to like say exactly like, oh, I'm writing a horror, a dark academia novel or a horror novel. Like it's usually somewhere in between, and then there's a sort of like a general consensus of like what it is. But I was fortunate because when I wrote this book, it was kind of before the dark academia like became more trendy and more popular, and I think Babel for that. And there's like so many people who are writing in this space as well, and it's become more of like a thing. Like I don't want to say like a desirable genre, but genres come and go, and they're kind of in vogue or not. And I feel like I was lucky in that, an Academy for Liars is published at a time where people are actively excited about dark academia, and that was not something I thought about while writing it. I literally called it also my unpitchable book because I just didn't really know where it fit. So that was pure luck. Although I will say I had read The Secret History, and that one was published I think in 92. So I think it's always been there. But one thing I'm noticing even with like romantasy lately is the way that people have been writing romantasy for so long, but we have a name for it now. And when we have a name for it and we lump all of those books together as this is romantasy or this is dark academia, it becomes a trend. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing because it's helping books hit shelves and helping authors like me learn how to market the stuff that they're writing. So, yeah.
Awesome. So this book is centered around a school that teaches the magic of persuasion. How was it kind of like building out this magic system? And then what did you want to kind of most explore when figuring out how that worked?
Oh, it was really fun. I think I really enjoy writing about magic, but the challenge that the challenge I set up for myself when I approached an Academy for Liars is I wanted a type of magic that felt almost like it could blend seamlessly into our world. I love reading books where there's like, witches and werewolves, and there's like wards that protect them from like mundane people like me from being able to know these things exist. But I knew that wasn't what I was aiming for with this book. I wanted a magic system where you could understand, oh, like the world isn't the way it is in spite of this magic system. It's because of it, right? And so I wanted a power that felt kind of a little bit more realistic, or like I could imagine someone using this power to kind of shape the world into the world that we have today, which is a pretty toxic and dark and prejudiced place. So in some ways maybe that's pessimistic, but so when I was building the world, I was kind of approaching it that way. And my main character Lennon, I think, really guided me because she's a character who's very much in her own head, and her mind is not necessarily a safe place for her. And so I think that this magic system, when it came to like her ambitions and the way that she moved through the world, and I knew that the magic system was probably going to be very psychological and kind of attached to this inherent struggle that she has, this battle against her own mind and psyche, which is like a core theme of the book. So I wanted to explore that through the magic, and that's what I attempted to do, and hopefully landed.
Much of Lennon's personality is kind of left unclarified early on in the story, and we see her like hold on to these different narratives and like how she sees herself, and partially she sees herself as like a needy woman at the whim of more powerful men, and who like needs those men to not only feel wanted but important and worthy. And then as the story continues and we spend more time weighing which narratives that Lennon holds like benefit or detract from the image Lennon and even her peers have of themselves. When you like one of the questions is like, how did you get here? And people will talk about like where they were in their lives before they found Drayton. How important is understanding and crafting a narrative to the act of persuasion, and those characters' narratives of themselves to their kind of gifts of persuasion?
Oh, that's a really good question. It was deeply important to me. I think I knew kind of a few things going in. about persuasion. I knew that this power is arguably unethical, right? You're meddling in people's minds without their consent. And it takes a specific kind of person, perhaps not what we would conventionally call a good person, to want to engage with that power enthusiastically. So I knew immediately the cast was going to be morally gray. But also with that, I have a lot of empathy for the characters that populate this world, because many of them have chosen this through a sense of desperation, through feeling disempowered, or some of them, though, are just kind of like ambitious and they're seeking to kind of right the wrongs of their past by embracing a power that is kind of both toxic and dangerous. So yeah, for me, it was very important that the characters I chose to be in the story and the characters that are enrolled at Drayton were kind of chosen for a specific reason, because somebody or someone or some entity was selecting them for these roles. I think that the way that I kind of conceptualized it is that there had to be an inherent power imbalance, right, where they're desperate enough to kind of go along with this invitation. They don't have as many perhaps opportunities as other people, so they're desperate for something, some calling to be realized. Most of them have kind of felt like their time has passed them by, or that they were destined for something greater and it never happened, and then it finally does, and they're kind of desperate to jump on it. And I also knew that the school is kind of preying on that in order to manipulate them as they're training them to manipulate other people. So yeah, it's very interwoven for me. And I did have to kind of spend quite a bit of time examining each character and why they would choose to do this and what it said about them that they did. And usually the answer was not great. I mean, I think all of my characters have some level of trauma, or if they've been through something, but I think all of them are very morally gray. And I just don't think I don't think that necessarily, I think it's even in the book, like a good person could necessarily wield power like this. And actually, I will say that I come away from a lot of magic novels feeling this, right? Because I think that so many, like the way that magic manifests in so many books, a lot of it, when you just look at it bare minimum, is like a breakdown of consent, right? Like even things that seem more innocent or like less like scary magic, like for example, I'm thinking of like illusion work. You're quite literally like changing what people see. It's like light gaslighting, and I think that like when you explore the capabilities of power like that, especially when it's unregulated, it almost becomes difficult for me to believe that people would willingly dabble in that. Like it gives me Oppenheimer vibes, you know? Like, and so that was definitely something I wanted to deal with and grapple with in this book, is instead of just looking at one being like, oh, I can like, you know, manipulate rats and like I could stop bad people from doing bad things, the kind of adult realization that but bad people are going to use this to do bad things, and just what is my role in that, and am I one of those people if I proceed? So yeah,
I think that's like really cool, and I think we see that pretty early on too, with like kind of the struggles of some of the students, and then the other students not having those struggles, and you're like, oh, like the morality scale within the characters. How did you want to represent this this kind of morality scale and this narrative crafting in the legend of the school's founding? And also, I mean, you touched a little bit upon like the desperation of stuff that these students have in their entry to the school, but like, yeah, like how does that translate in your mind to like on the school side, like the legend and story of the school's founding, but also like the school's entry to the students, if that makes sense.
The school's entry to the students. So you mean like the history of the school as tied to like true atrocities in some ways, like
yeah, and then also like how the school chooses the applicants, you know, are they also picking out those narratives? I mean, you mentioned like they're kind of manipulating them to learn how to manipulate, but like what is it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the school is specifically in my mind choosing people that they think can manipulate in specific ways, and I think it's, you know, they're choosing people because sometimes people who look a certain way can better manipulate people from the same group, or who have a commonality there. So I think that's kind of what's somewhat sinister about the school. It's like they want in some ways to have diversity because it allows them to have certain ends or abilities to reach people they otherwise wouldn't. Obviously, when the school first founded, it's set in Savannah, Georgia, and everyone knows the history of the American South. So but it was like very, very white, and this power was kind of contained to specific people with privilege and white in the South, white people in the South. But I think as the school progressed, they kind of realized that instead of being afraid of placing this power into the hands of people of color or people who are more marginalized, they could actually use that to have more and greater reach. And so I think that's why a lot like the students are kind of like remarkably diverse, because it's actually part of the manipulation. And I think, the inspiration for that comes from, of course, just our world, schools wanting to kind of have this appearance of like, oh, we're diverse, we're like, and all of the accolades and the good stuff that comes from that, but not really actually meaningfully caring about any of that. It's kind of like, I think, common for a lot of like institutions. And I think Drayton was no different, but I kind of wanted to explore that, this illusion that this place that has, this bastion of power is like, oh, I'm bestowing you with this gift, but really you're just becoming part of the manipulation.
Yeah, and then we also we see the leadership of Drayton encouraging those levels of desperation in their courses.
Yeah.
What do you hope the readers gain or gather about how the students' need influences persuasion, or anyone's need influences the persuasion that you can have or people could take over them?
I don't know. Oh, that's a great question. I don't know that I thought about necessarily what readers need, but more that I think that if anything, I would want someone to come to the book and understand that, like, there are many reasons that people become complicit, and that can happen in many different ways. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're like a terrible person or anything like that, but to perhaps see their own experiences reflected. Because I know that, at least for me, that's, existing in this world sometimes feels like you were complicit in terrible things, and yet we make the decisions we make for very specific reasons. Sometimes those reasons are survival, sometimes those reasons are selfishness, and I think that it's a fraught thing. And so I think I less have a specific takeaway for readers, and more that I would like to see them perhaps like have them feel like their experiences are reflected on the page through these characters who are going through this experience at Drayton, that's sort of remaking them and changing them into something that perhaps isn't good. Because I think I've definitely been there myself, where I'm like involved in something that feels like actively bad for me, but at the same time, my own desperation makes me cling to it for whatever reason. And I think that's kind of a very human point of connection that I would love readers to see reflected on the page.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, Drayton has so much like influence itself over everyone that comes within its walls. So that a lot of the relationships that we see in the book, there's a stark power difference between either the faculty and a student, or even the students themselves, as their different levels of persuasion, like persuasionist to persuasionish. Do you think there's something about Drayton and these characters that like have them and lead them into these sort of relationships with each other?
Absolutely. I think that it's almost like in a way, a kind of, I would call it even like a kind of grooming, right? Like when the power or the magic system is essentially inherently a breach of consent, it calls into question a lot of the other ways that consent can be kind of breached or compromised. And I think that's perhaps why students at Drayton have this kind of comfort level with these breaches, because they're being kind of trained to accept that, because that is the magic system itself. And I think for me as the author, it just made sense to kind of explore that, all the different ways that could manifest itself, given that this is like the central magic system. I knew that it didn't just end with like rats or them manipulating other people. Like consent can be warped and challenged and breached in so many different ways. And given that was kind of a core theme of the book, it felt like, yeah, like there's no way people practice a power, like use a power like this and then don't kind of have blatant and flagrant oversteps in other areas. So it felt kind of right to explore that. But I think the book it's a book about power, and I think I was really interested in exploring what people do with it within the context of Drayton, where they're kind of unabashedly accepting that the power that they're wielding is in some ways like unethical, or maybe just inherently unethical.
Yeah, and like in addition to that, the history of Drayton seems to demand a lot of sacrifice from people,
Mhm.
but especially its Black students and
Yes.
faculty, specifically Lennon, Dante, and William. And why was it important for you to show this unfair division of sacrifice along racial lines and gender to an extent as well?
I think because it's, for me, it's just like it's inarguably the reality, and I know that there's people who would argue against that, but I don't believe it. And as a Black person who's moved through this world, I know that, like, you know, we always pay a higher price, and that's just something that it is true to me, and I know that it is the truth. And so I wanted to kind of explore that. You're not going to have a university that is set in the Deep South that doesn't have an extremely horrible, probably past with racism. And I think that, having grown up in the South, I think there's this idea that, like, that's the past and it doesn't affect now the present, and we've divorced ourselves from that, we've washed our hands of it. But it's like, but you're still, like, the buildings that you host your classes in were built by enslaved people.
Hmm.
Like, there's no way that that doesn't shape and affect the culture of your university. And so I think that reality is sort of like set aside, right? Even by Lennon through much of the book. Like, she is aware of it, it pops up on her radar, and she almost like just kind of like sets it aside and doesn't choose to directly deal with it. And I think that that's both a risk and like an illusion that a lot of us apply to ourselves, because it's almost in some ways, I think, like survival when you're in these institutions, to not think about these things, because, you know, white students, I don't think they necessarily have to. They don't carry that burden. It wasn't necessarily their ancestors who were building those buildings, or whose labor and bodies were expended to create these institutions. But that's a burden that we carry. And I think that the ways that we choose to cope with that, especially within the context of these institutions, it can do a lot of damage, and it's very fraught and difficult. And so, yeah, I think that's something that I wanted to be an undercurrent, but at the same time, I didn't want it to dominate the entirety of the narrative, since it was London's story and she has obviously a lot to deal with. So it's a lot of it's kind of about the things we choose to set aside, and also like when we choose to engage them, or when we're forced to, how we respond, and why do we respond that way. So it's definitely something that I kind of considered with shaping the book. I didn't want to like spoon feed it to readers, but I kind of wanted it to be obvious that certain students are paying a higher price, and you know why. So
Yeah, it definitely felt like it was like an undercurrent of the book, even though it wasn't like necessarily explicit is not really the word, but just like right in your face. It's like, no, I'm seeing how this is how these things
right,
are connected.
right, and I think people know. It's not like, you know, I grew up in the South. Like, people definitely know, but there's this very, you know, that they know because of the way that they choose to talk around it or excuse it.
Hmm.
And so I knew that I didn't have to like spoon feed readers so that they knew what was going on, but at the same time, I wanted to hold people accountable in a way, or at least these institutions accountable for this, because it's not, unfortunately, there's a lot of parts of my book that are fiction. Unfortunately, like, that sordid history with, you know, the founding of the school is not, you know, fictional. You know, that didn't just come from my mind. That's the reality of many of the schools here in the United States. And I wanted to kind of explore that, and the implications of that. So
Yeah, it was real. It was real.
thank
Good job.
you. Thank you.
Here on Wizard Team, it's no surprise that we love books. We also love supporting the independent bookstores.
With our bookshop affiliate link, you can not only get all the books on your TBR, but you can support indie bookstores and B&C at the same time.
And if you're not sure what you want, that ain't no problem. Check out our The Plot Thickens list, full of recommendations from none other than Porshèa herself.
Head to www.bookshop.org/shop/blacknerdscreate to treat your shelves.
Treat your shelves.
Oh, that's nice. That's clever.
Oh my goodness.
That's clever.
So we kind of touched on this too, but morality is a major theme in this book. And Lennon is not only having to confront the ramifications of her power, but having her own sense of morality and self pushed and twisted as she continues her learning at Drayton. We live in a society that demands a very specific and docile presentation of Black women in particular. And this book sort of demands the opposite of Lennon, where it feels like her instinct is to be softer and caring, but she's being demanded to kind of push the boundaries of that. What made her corruption arc, or maybe not corruption so much as like the graying of her morality, so necessary for this story?
I think what made it necessary was like the moment that she chose to stay after she found out what persuasion was. I knew that once I had a character who would make a decision like that, if she proceeded, that she would become more corrupt, because I think that that's the natural trajectory for anybody who dabbles in a power like that. Like, I think it's inherently kind of evil. And I think that when you inherently and then later throughout the book ambitiously and enthusiastically engage with a power that is kind of an inherent breach of consent, that you don't walk away from that unscathed, that begins to kind of corrupt you. And I think, yeah, it was interesting, because I think that the question I had to ask myself was that, when I was introduced to Lena at the beginning of the book, she's kind of a very broken character. And I think in some ways that initially I thought that, her brokenness was indicative of a kind of vulnerability or softness. I think that that is still true. But at the same time, I think that in some ways, because of her illness and the things that she struggles with, Lennon hasn't really had the chance to become the person that she actually is. And the person that she actually is, I think, a much darker version of the person we're introduced to in the beginning of the book. Not to spoil a lot, but she has this kind of like ambition, and you mentioned earlier, and you're so right, like her need for validation through the men that she engages with. And that was actually when I realized that she had that kind of almost like compulsive desire, I dug deeper and I was like, where is that coming from? And I realized, oh, she's attaching herself to men that she views as powerful, but she wants power. Like she likes the men, but she wants this proximity to the power that they hold, which is why she kind of continually pursues men that are more powerful than her. And obviously it's not just one-sided. Like, there is also kind of an imbalance of power, and they have a role in that as well. Like, it's some ways it's almost like a very sick mutualism. And I would not argue that she's not vulnerable in those situations, but there's a reason that she seeks those relationships out and is content to engage with them. And I think what I kind of realized was it's again it's her manifesting this desire to be closer to power and to kind of possess it in some way. And I think that's also kind of at the root of her corruption arc as well. Is when you have that like constant ambition to become more and more powerful, especially when you don't even know exactly why or what you want to do with that power. Once you have it, I think that it can lead you to a really dark place. And yeah, she's just very hungry. And I think that kind of fueled that.
It's funny that you say hungry, and like this is not at all this book. This is their last book that was published, but House of Hunger, like the hunger that lies within the main characters, kind of like having like this arc of those kind of characters. But thinking of character arcs, part of the darkening of multiple characters' morality within the story seems to stem from the school's leadership encouraging the idea that to hold power means to sacrifice your virtue. And with even Lennon's advisor, Dante, states that good lies are rewarded with belief, great lies are rewarded with conviction, and in my experience, persuasion is a great lie, well told. And something about like the lies and conviction really reminded me a lot of the very beginning of the story, and throughout we see more, but the very beginning of the story, we see Lennon shy away from her twisted like mirror self. And by the end, we've seen her confront both the light and the darkness and the twisted darkness of multiple different people. Is there a relationship with Lennon's tendency to push away her darker self while also embracing power and the great lie that is persuasion?
Oh, I really like this question. Let me just say, it's such an honor to be read like this deeply and have questions that are this thoughtful. Like, I just, every time you ask me a question, I'm just like, oh, I kind of wish that you had been with me while I was writing, because I think some of your questions would have made my whole entire writing process like much faster and much more interesting. So thank you so much.
We volunteers tribute for the next one.
That's what I mean to you. Like these 3 little like devil angels on my shoulder. Like
unless it's a horror, unless it's a like more scary than this was, you could just send.
Then
that
you
to
can still
Bayana
count
and
me in
Porshèa.
because I love horror.
You can send that to Bayana and Porshèa, and I will just like cheer from the sidelines.
thank you. I appreciate that.
This is at the limit of my.
This is it for you.
My
I
appetite for
appreciate you
horror.
pushing through. I think that Lennon has a lot of self-loathing, and I think it's kind of interesting because at some parts of the story she loathes herself for being too weak, which is perhaps it's predominantly that, and then she's also terrified though of this idea of her becoming dark and too strong and too and like this inability to be controlled and like this kind of id figure, right, which is what she sees in the mirror. And so I think in a lot of ways it's just like it's a manifestation of her rejection of self, and then through practicing persuasion I think she's able to bring these two sides of herself into actually I'm going to take that back. I was going to say that she brings them into alignment, but in some ways I think that the end of the book is almost her like beginning to like reject her weakness in some way and just kind of embrace the fact that she is this closer to this id figure, and then just kind of accepting that, because I'm not sure that she ever fully accepts or allows herself to accept the full scope of her vulnerability. I think she just kind of resents herself for it, and I think that's why it's like I think some stories, you know, you come to the conclusion and it's a character who's kind of come a long way and fully accepted themselves. I'm not sure I can necessarily say the same for Lennon. And I knew that going in that this was not going to be like a clear cut, and she learns her lesson. Like she learns some stuff, but like there are other parts of her that she entirely rejects and I don't think ever intends to kind of deal with it. I think that in some ways that this grabbing for power is a substitute for her having to actually confront her own weaknesses and take accountability. Yeah. So, and yeah, it's so interesting because the whole time I was writing this, I'm like, oh my God, I know. Like, I knew people were going to like resent her. I resented her in some ways, but I was also fascinated with her, and I hope that other people would be as well, because I think she was complete chaos. I think the main characters I've written before, I like to think, at least largely, I liked them. Like there were parts of them that I really liked, and I'm not saying I don't like parts of Lennon, but I knew she was really thorny, and it was going to be really, really difficult. And my touchstones for this character were also like, you know, I grew up, I'm like aging myself here, but like I grew up like watching like UK Skins, and like I like, you know, I was on Tumblr during like the Effie, like when Effie was like running her kingdom, and everybody was like, you know, showing photos of her like smeared makeup and smoking a cigarette, and I really wanted like to see kind of myself reflected in like a chaotic Black female main character. Can I curse here? I forgot to ask.
Yeah,
I wanted like a character who's like fucking losing it, you know, and who is that kind of like Effie-ish type. But I knew that also going into that, you know, black female characters aren't necessarily received in the same way as their white counterparts. I knew that it had to be inherently different, and so I had some trepidation when it came to writing her character, but ultimately I just kind of followed her through it. And yeah, it was fun. It was definitely fun to write a character that wasn't necessarily a good person. Perhaps a character that I probably wouldn't want to be part of my life or my own friend circle. Like I don't trust her. But that feeling of not trusting her really made the writing experience so fun, because I didn't always know what she was going to do. Whereas like with my first book, Emmanuel, as the main character named Emmanuel, The Year of the Witch, and she's just really kind. And so most of the time when she makes a decision, I know she's going to make the decision that hurts as few people as possible, and it's a, you know, good and moral decision. But with Lennon, it's like all bets are off. You know, she when she kind of begins to remove herself from morality, or at least kind of begins to craft what some might argue is like a kind of warped system of morals, it became harder for me to kind of guess what she was going to do next. And that was fun as an author.
It was fun as a reader. I'll say, like, in this world of like Real Housewives and me enjoying Real Housewives, I don't have a problem with following someone I don't like. I do sometimes, but kind of don't, because I'm just like, I don't care for this person, but it's drama and I'm here for drama. Chaos, sign me up. I'm not living through the chaos. They're living through the chaos, and I can just be right there with them as they're doing
is what that is. I was trying to figure out how to like articulate it, but it is like kind of the like Housewives effect of just being like, this is so messy, and like,
also, it's the being able to actually feel morally superior, like confidently morally superior and you're just like, girl, what are you doing?
Right.
Like, remember your qualms at the beginning of this?
And
Like,
she's
how
like,
far we have strayed.
That was kind of like my real question was like, and I at some point I was reading it, I was like, how reliable of a narrator should I treat Lennon? Because
Yeah.
she said one thing and she keeps saying, oh, but I'm nice. And I'm like, are you nice? Because I
That's
don't know
the
if you're
thing. I
actually
had the
nice.
same thing. I was like, do you just want to be a nice person or are you? And I think that that's something that a lot of people deal with.
Or
Like,
do you even really want to be a nice person? Do you think that's
Right.
what you're supposed to be,
Right.
but
I
you
think
don't
that
actually want it?
exactly. I think a lot of people like to have the appearance of being a nice person. And I think a lot of people find it useful to be considered a nice person. It opens doors for you. And I think that sometimes I was like asking myself how much of this character just wants to be perceived as nice because it that allows her to get what she wants. But when she doesn't need to do that anymore, then what does she do? And I think
I always thought of it as like, or I kind of read her as, I will be nice as long as the niceness and the kindness doesn't butt up against my desire.
exactly.
It's a thing of like the liberals who are like, yeah, I'll vote for all of these policies or whatever, and then like a policy of like affordable housing in my neighborhood though, like no thank you, right? So it's like as soon as it like starts to inconvenience me, and I think that there's a scene with her getting car keys from someone that she's like, oh, like kind of waffling, but he's not a good character or a good person, a nice person, it seems like. So it felt like her waffle did not take nearly as long as like her waffle with the rat.
Right. But I think
it was like,
also I think that like I think the way I ration, and I shouldn't like I try not to insert myself into my characters too much, but I think it's a thing that I do, right? Where like I think that with her and the rat, it's like she sees this rat as like defenseless and innocent. I think she sees grown men as perhaps not. So it's actually more wrong for her to influence an innocent rat that hasn't done anything to her, really isn't capable of doing anything, than it is to a grown man who's probably has his own crimes of the past and like sins and faults. Like it's kind of like she's like, well, he's done wrong and I'll do wrong to him. He's a man. But a rat, like a little innocent rat, she feels, I think, genuine empathy. And I'm not, I don't think that necessarily makes her a good person, but I do think it makes her kind of like, it makes her more interesting because I think that, I think most people in their heads, they have this hierarchy. It's like we can allow for like experimenting on lab rats. We all do. We take medicines that are tested on animals and we all participate in that. But like as soon as it's a human, we're like, oh my God, even if they're like, really terrible, we're like, no. And I think Lennon's worldview is slightly skewed. Like she'd be probably more likely, if it came down to it, to choose saving like a little innocent rat than she would like a human life if she felt like the person wasn't a great person. I mean, her not having that hierarchy is kind of like messed up, arguably, but like that's just how, that's how she presented herself to me on the page. And I knew that, I had an interesting character that was going to make interesting decisions. And it's kind of nice to kind of like wash your hands of it, because I think something as an author, something interesting that happens when you're writing, if you are kind of giving your moral stamp of approval to a character, this is a good person who makes good decisions, or a moral character, and then the character makes a decision that other people are like, oh, that's an immoral decision, and you as the author are saying it's a good decision that this character has done this thing, then people start to be like, oh, what's wrong with your worldview, or like, and with Lennon, it was kind of fun just to be like, why am I washing my hands of it? Like, she does what she does. I'm not saying that she's a hero. Like, she's just messed up. And then I get to like experience that as an author and watch like the fallout. And it was really, really fun. And which is not to say I don't like Lennon. I do, but I don't necessarily think that she's like the most moral character I've ever created. Quite in some ways, like, yeah, she's farther along on that spectrum. And that was really fun for me. And a bit of a challenge, sure. But I think also, I'm definitely like, as a reader, I'm not the kind of reader who like, I'm really confused when people are like, oh, I didn't like this character, I wouldn't want to be their friend. Like, I just don't like them. Like, I never, when I pick a book, ever consider whether I want to be friends with the characters I'm reading about. No. I could not care less. Like, give me good prose, give me interesting decisions, give me a fun plot. Like, I'm there for like, vibe setting, all of that. But like, I don't need to like them or want to be friends with them or think that they're good people. I just, I'm here for the experience of reading, and it's just like they're kind of unrelated. So I think, lately there's like been, I think, more discourse about like likable characters and whether or not like, and the reasons that people read or don't read. And I think that like for some people it's inherently uncomfortable to insert themselves into the mind and perspective of a character that they don't like, wouldn't want to be friends with, and think is bad and wrong. And I don't know if that's like just a more self-insert approach to fiction, which is also something I don't do. I don't really think of myself as the character while I'm reading at all. So I don't know if that's the difference, or if it's just kind of like some of us like mess. And I don't deny that I like mess. And I think that that's probably most writers of like dark fiction and horror. I think that we write this because we like looking at the nitty gritty gross stuff. So
Marie Kondo. It's like so many. Like in your discussion, I heard that you are Marie Kondo, but also you are a producer for a housewife show. Like you're like, I didn't create the drama, but I did stir it up.
I think that's the fun in it. I think, yeah, like there is also, I think, something like satisfying to me about being able to like write a story that's like so messy with so many messy characters. Sorry, I got distracted with a really cute puppy. I'm sorry. Like really messy characters, and then being able to kind of create a sense of order or a plot or a coherence in a story. Like it indulges both sides of myself. The part that likes like a puzzle and like that likes order and setting things right, but also the part that just wants to like sit there in front of the flames and like eat my popcorn and like clap my hands. And yeah, so that was kind of what I wanted to do with this book, and I think it really. It was fun. It was fun for me, for sure.
We kind of got on the like tangent of like hierarchy for a second there that I want to like pull into, specifically about the hierarchy that Lennon holds in her head for like who she feels comfortable persuading, and like how the fact that she has an older sister who, when she tries to persuade her, rejects that persuasion each time. So what do you think, like what was that happening there with like her sister who has no skills in being taught persuasion, and that's outside of her being a lawyer? The way that she would react to Lennon's persuasion and Lennon's lack of finesse, like that she just couldn't do it as well with her sister. Was there more to, was it related to her being a lawyer? Because that's kind of where I took it, but it could be something else.
I think it was two things. I think the first was that I think there was a bit of guilt, perhaps, and their relationship was kind of affecting her performance there. I think that of like all the people that Lennon persuades or uses her power against in the book, she probably perhaps feels the most guilty, but using it on her sister, and she kind of grapples with that and feels, I think I saw those moments of when she persuaded her sister as being turning points where I knew she was kind of going down this darker arc. Like they were big moments for me in her, when I plotted out her internal arc, those were the moments that had kind of like pins in them. It's like, this is a key turning point. So I think that she was in some ways almost like emotionally having difficulty in cracking under that pressure. But I also think that Carly, and this is something that, doesn't appear on the page, but something I've thought about at length when it comes to her sister, is that I think that in some ways she could have just as easily been chosen for Drayton as Lennon. But the reason that she wasn't chosen was perhaps because her moral backbone is different. And she wouldn't have been able to she didn't have the desperation or need to be able to be the kind of student that Drayton would have wanted her to be. Like, she wouldn't have played along or been manipulated as easily because she wasn't desperate. So I think that, that there was that too. I think that, yeah, it was very intentional that I made her kind of like unusually resistant because I didn't want this idea that like there's nobody else that could possibly wield this power except for like the very select handful of people who are chosen. The select handful of people are chosen for their strengths, but perhaps more importantly, their weaknesses. And because those weaknesses allow the school to kind of control them. If you have just like a bunch of like really strong people who are brought into the school, they're going to do what they want to do, and that's not what the school wants. So yeah, that was something that I considered while writing that scene.
So although An Academy for Liars doesn't shy away from cruelty on the page, you thankfully don't leave readers with a cliffhanger when you could have chosen to do so. So what led you to kind of give this story a more decisive ending? Although I guess I would argue in some ways there are some things that are a little more open.
I left some things open-ended because I like to always have a door cracked if I ever want to, go back to the world. I don't have any plans to do that now. I don't have any plans to write a sequel, but I never say never. So I always like to have somewhere to pick up and some way to return. But I wrote I don't even know how many more endings to this story than I probably did any other. It was a lot of experimentation, and I'm lucky enough to be able to work with my editor and have that kind of perspective, and for her to kind of give me her feedback as a reader. I have an agent too who helps with that, and kind of get their perspectives on the book. And so I think that my choice to kind of close the ending as much as I did was me really kind of deciding, okay, this is what I want to leave readers with, and then testing the different versions of the ending and seeing which ones kind of got closest to that. I think that in some ways the book in my mind is always going to be different than the one that's like in print, but my job as the author is to try to get them as close as possible. And yeah, I think that the ending was my attempt to do that. And I think I wanted, and I felt like the characters kind of deserved some level of resolution. So that was me wanting to give that to them.
Amazing. I think from a reader's perspective, I appreciated it, but it's also one of those endings where you're like, I bet you if you asked me versus Bayana versus Porshèa, like, what is Lennon's life a year from that moment or 6 months from that moment, we would have completely different answers. So I think that that's also like, it definitely closed. It's not a cliffhanger, but it does allow for ambiguity.
That's exactly what I was hoping for too. Like, I think that, like, given that she's so unpredictable, I think that I knew everyone was going to have a slightly different takeaway and perspective of her. So kind of getting it as close as possible and like leaving the rest was something that I definitely wanted to do. Like, she's okay enough, but what follows is like kind of anyone's guess. I have my theories, and I'm sure that like everyone has theirs, but yeah, it is interesting. I think I wanted to kind of like lean toward ambiguity without also like having a book that kind of promises a sequel when I'm not sure that's something that I would, that I want to do or be beholden to, is really what it comes down to. I always want to write the story that I'm most passionate about, that I think I can do the best at that time. And I cannot necessarily promise that that's going to be the one unless I'm actively writing it or have started. And that wasn't the case with Academy for Liars.
Well, thank you so much. What can we expect from you next, if you can tell us?
I don't think I have anything formally announced that I can talk about yet, but there are other things. There are other books in the pipeline. I really hope that I'll be able to share them soon. I'll probably always continue to kind of like write between genres, trending toward darker stories. But yeah, I definitely am sitting on a couple of secrets right now that I'm like trying to contain so that no one is like, I don't think anyone would be really that upset, but I know that I'm not supposed to talk yet. But yeah,
we're not going to see a cozy fantasy from you anytime soon.
Probably not. No,
like they're sitting in the coffee shop, just drinking and talking about life. No, okay,
probably not. I do love a cozy fantasy though, but yeah.
That's hilarious because for Robyn. But thank you so much for joining us.
Sometimes
you have an agenda, and we fantasy, respect that.
But you have a generalized anxiety disorder.
I get that. I also have generalized anxiety.
And so it is just nice sometimes to open the book knowing that you're not gonna have nightmares at the end.
I can totally agree with you. I'm a huge scaredy pants myself. Like I am. So I can both relate, and I also can't. I don't have any excuses or reasons why this comes out of me. I'm just as anxious as you, and I do
apologize. Comes out. Mine comes out from like just obviously like copious amounts of time with dogs, and yours comes out with light horror.
Yeah.
Well, not light.
Yeah.
Different levels of horror in your story.
Yeah.
To each their own.
That's true.
However we cope, we cope.
And with that, thank you so much, Alexis, for joining us. If you will, please let people know where they can find you and your work.
Yeah, you can find my work. I'm on Instagram. I'm Alexis H, and then my website is alexishenderson.com. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I do have a newsletter that I update periodically, and you can find that on my website.
Awesome. Thank you all for listening. Join us on Wednesday for our next episode of Wizard Team, where we will be continuing our read of Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn.
Wizard Team is a part of the Black Nerds Create Collective. If you want to keep up with our content, you can check out our website at blacknerdscreate.com. Follow us on Instagram and Tumblr at Wizard Team Pod and at Black Nerds Create.
Cool. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.